Good morning, afternoon. Morning, afternoon. Good morning, afternoon. Afternoon. Good morning, 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 good morning, good morning, good morning. This is your Survivor to Thriver message today. So, we're not just going to talk about, which we never talk about struggle, right? But in relation to these forms of words, okay, people like to familiarize CPTSD or PTSD or anxiety or stress. They like to align it with a form of stress and struggle. And that's exactly what we do opposite. We take these words, we take these concepts, and we put them on their knees, begging please. Okay. So we're not talking about struggle. We're not talking about stress. We are getting to the actual solutions here when it comes to surviving, to thriving. So I want to look at what Pete Walker has to say in chapter 1. And I picked up this book a couple weeks ago at the thrift store, kind of browsing. And I was like, wait a minute. I ain't never heard of this one before. Let me go ahead and read it, and read through it. And baby, it is very easily read, very easily understood. Book title is called Complex PTSD From Surviving to Thriving by Pete Walker. So before we get into chapter 1, I actually want to get and talk about some key concepts as we go through the chapter to kind of just familiarize yourself with and to pay attention to what we are going to explore. Some of these key concepts were almost revolutionary for me. It's like, oh, wow, that makes sense. So, we're going to talk about the definition of CPTSD, where we're moving beyond the standard PTSD to include the effects of prolonged childhood abandonment or neglect. The second point we're going to refer to is emotional flashbacks, where we identify those sudden, often non-visual regressions to the overwhelming feeling states of childhood, those emotional flashbacks. And the third points we will refer to are the 4F responses: how flight, fight, freeze, and fawn manifest in survivors. And then for our fourth bullet point, we're going to talk about the goal of recovery. That healing is it's a gradual process of moving from a state of constant survival into one where you can truly thrive. Okay, you can truly thrive now. You can truly thrive today. But for everyone, there's different levels. Okay. We know we are all not microwave systems. Okay, we all have unique realities, but know that there is an end, and note that it's not a lifelong, prolonged depression, anxiety through the forms of PTSD from complex PTSD. It's not a lifelong reflection, because that would be crazy, right? That would be crazy to suffer a lifelong from these particular concepts, right? So now that we talked about the 4 points, let's get into chapter 1, the journey of recovery from CPSD. Now, this is not from a psychology class, okay, or course. So these terms and definitions and paragraphs are going to be very, very easily read. Don't forget to thumbs up the video, like, and subscribe, because can't stop, won't stop. We're going to always thrive. Gratitude. Thank y'all for being here today. Okay, so Mr. Paul here is going to talk, or Mr. Pete Walker. Pete Walker. So he says, I wrote this book from the perspective of someone who has complex post traumatic stress disorder, CPTSD, and who has experienced a great reduction of symptoms over the years. He also wrote it from the viewpoint of someone who has discovered many silver linings in the long, windy, bumpy road of recovering from CPTSD. He says he's also seeing this type of recovery in a number of his friends and many long term clients. All right, first, the good news about CPTSD, which is complex post traumatic stress disorder. It is a learned set of responses and a failure to complete numerous important developmental tasks. Very key to underline. The good news about CPTSD, it is a learned set of responses and a failure to complete numerous important developmental tasks. This means that it is environmentally, not genetically caused. In other words, unlike most of the diagnosis it is confused with, it is neither inborn or categorological. As such, it is learned. It is not inscribed in your DNA. It is a disorder caused by nurture, or rather the lack of, not nature. So it is a learned behavior structured by your environment. It is obviously, like he was just saying, it isn't anything that you're born with that is genetically passed through. Okay, CPSD is something that is born in an environment. Okay, he's going to talk a little bit more about that. This is especially good news because what is learned can be unlearned and vice versa. What was not provided by your parents can now be provided by yourself and others. Recovering from CPTSD typically has important self help and relational components. Self help and relational components. The relational piece can come from authors, friends, partners, teachers, therapists, therapeutic groups, or any combination of these. I like to call this reparenting by committee. And I love how he just put that reparenting by committee because that's what we've been doing for years, right? Reparenting by committee. This is why social media is so beautiful, coming together and have a community, a group, like-minded people, right? On different levels, but like-minded people. So that's where he's talking about the relational piece, all right? But he says, I must emphasize, however, that some survivors of CPTSD engendering families were so thoroughly betrayed by their parents that it may be a long time, if ever, before they can trust another human being enough to engage in relational healing work. And this is why a lot of people isolate themselves indefinitely, right? Because there's a trust issues with relating to other people due to their environmental foundations, right? And he goes on to say, which I love this so much. Um, If ever being that can trust another human being enough is to engage in relational healing work, when this is the case, pets, books, and online therapeutic websites can provide significant relational healing. Let's read that again. I must emphasize, however, that some survivors of CPTSD engendering families were so thoroughly betrayed by their parents that it may be a long time, if ever, before they can trust another human being enough to engage in relational healing work. When this is the case, pets, books, and online therapeutic websites can provide significant relational healing. Okay, so you're never alone. We know why pets are so significant because there have been case studies on cats, dogs, especially cats, decreasing stress levels, decreasing blood pressures, okay, helping regulate the body, bringing it to the homeostasis level because animals can sense, they have greater senses than us humans can, okay, obviously. So let's go on, you guys. So he's talking about the relational piece, all right? And he's referring to the self-help pieces of CPTSD where you can unlearn these environmental disparities in your childhood. He says this book describes a multimodal treatment approach to CPTSD. It is oriented toward the most prevalent kind of CPTSD, the kind that comes from growing up in a severely abusive and or neglectful family. In this vein, the book describes a journey of healing the damage that occurs when you suffer traumatizing abuse and abandonment. Traumatizing abuse and abandonment can occur on verbal, emotional, spiritual, and or physical levels. Moreover, sexual abuse is especially traumatizing. I believe that we have an epidemic of traumatizing families. Let's stop right there because I said that a long time ago. This is why the work continues for me. This is why the work continues because I just keep highlighting the points that I read from the RAIN website when I started this like 10 years ago. Whereas 1 in 3 girls will be sexually abused before 18, and then 1 in 5 boys will be sexually abused before they turn 18. So I don't know about you, but I know a lot of girls and boys, and this is why the work is continue and consistent. He says that current estimate points that 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys are sexually abused before they enter adulthood. And recent statistics from the Kim Foundation report that 20%, 26% of Americans over 18 have been diagnosed with a mental disorder. So, when abuse or neglect is severe enough in one category of it can cause the child to develop CPTSD. And this is true even in the case of emotional neglect, if both parents collude in it. And we see in chapter 5, okay. When abuse and neglect is multidimensional, the severity of the CPTSD worsens accordingly. Okay, so we have the emotional abuse, we have sexual abuse, we have, spiritual. People never refer to a form of spiritual abuse. Okay, that is big one. That's why a lot of people drop in and out of different religious formations. All right, you have verbal abuse, very big one. This is why I talk a lot about words of power because verbal abuse is huge, okay? Same as sexual abuse is huge, although sexual abuse is the worst, right? Moving on. So now we're going to get into, I want you guys to really highlight this point. Definitions of complex PTSD. So let's get into the definition of the complex PTSD. Finally, right? I know you're like, what is CPTSD? Okay. So it is a severe form of post-traumatic stress disorder. It is delineated from this better known trauma syndrome by 5 of its most common and troublesome features, okay? 1, emotional flashbacks. 2, toxic shame. 3, self abandonment. 4, a vicious inner critic. And 5, social anxiety. CPTSD SD is a more severe form of post traumatic stress disorder. It is delineated from this better known trauma syndrome by five of its most common and troublesome features. Emotional flashbacks. Sometimes you're eating food and you get emotional flashbacks. Something is stealing your energy. Okay. Or you're trying to watch TV, you're trying to focus on the story and you're getting a flashback, a story, okay, of your childhood, right? These are reflections of CPTSD. I'm just not sure on how you guys are aware of these emotional flashbacks, right? And that takes away your joy, that comes into your memory all of a sudden out of nowhere, right? When you're focused, when you're in alignment, you get an emotional flashback. Toxic shame, okay, is the second piece here, referring to like the feature of a syndrome. Toxic shame. When I think of toxic shame, I think of like how my grandfather used to ridicule my mother, right? Out in the open in front of everyone. Um, Basically, there's a lot of forms of toxic shame, but the one thing that came up for me was just how my grandfather would just totally put down all of his children in public, you know, out in the open, saying how stupid they are, saying how dumb they are, saying how black they are. Okay. Um, Toxic shame. The other part is self abandonment, where you remove yourself in self isolation. Another piece is a vicious inner critic. This is so key. I see this often when we talk to each other. When we talk to each other, do we come from a negative point? Okay. Because that is leaning onto the vicious inner critic. How you refer to yourself and others is how you talk to yourself internally. And the last point is social anxiety. We all know inside. I've never seen so much social anxiety in the last 10 years until now. Right. So he's going to get into the first point of this complex syndrome of the five common features, right? Which is emotional flashbacks. Emotional flashbacks are perhaps the most noticeable and characteristic feature of CPTSD. Survivors of traumatizing abandonment are extremely susceptibility to painful emotional flashbacks, which, unlike PTSD, do not typically have a visual component. Emotional flashbacks are sudden and often prolonged regressions to the overwhelming feeling states of being an abused, abandoned child. Okay, I want everyone to be aware of this in your thoughts. This is why we're changing our thoughts, right? When we change our thoughts, we can pay attention to like the circulation of them, right? Who's giving us these memories or what are these memories? Like we're really in tuned, all right, and analyzing the things that are coming through our massive brain computer. So let's say that again. So the emotional flashbacks are sudden and often prolonged regressions to the overwhelming feeling states of being an abused and abandoned child. These feelings states can include overwhelming fear, shame, alienation, rage, grief, and depression. They also include unnecessary triggering of our fight and flight instincts. Very big, very big, very big. I can remember walking around like 8 years ago working, and one girl was like, "Girl, you always look like, um, You about to get in trouble or something. Or something. I can't remember quite what the word she looked at, but it wasn't scary, but she was like, "Girl, you always be looking like, something like you're always in trouble or you're running from somebody or some shit." So, and that's that fight or flight instinct that is like part of a flashback that's coming from earlyhood childhood development. He goes on to say that finally, a more clinical and extensive definition of CPTSD can be found on page 121 of Judith Herman's seminal book, Trauma and Recovery. So now, this is what I love, examples, right? Examples, examples, examples. We got you the definition, we got you the outline. So let's do an example of an emotional flashback because sometimes we're just not aware that we're having these states that's causing anxiety, that's causing fear, okay, that's causing social anxiety, self isolation, talking negatively to yourself, okay? So here's an example. He's like, as I write this, I recall the first emotional flashback I was ever able to identify. See, that's key because sometimes we aren't identifying these things. That's why I was saying to analyze the brain computer. Although I did not identify it until about 10 years after it occurred. At this time of the event, I was living with my first serious partner. The honeymoon phase of our relationship came to a screeching halt when she unexpectedly started yelling at me for something I no longer recall. What I do most vividly recall was how the yelling felt. It felt like a fierce, hot wind. I felt like I was being blown away, like my insides were being blown out, and a as a flame on a candle is blown out because he couldn't respond. Later, when I first heard about auras, I flashed back to this and felt like my aura had been completely stripped from me. At the time itself, I also felt completely disoriented, unable to speak, respond, or even think. I felt terrified, shaky, and very little. Somehow I finally managed to totter to the door and get out of the house where I eventually slowly pulled myself together. As I said earlier, it took me 10 years to figure out that this confusing and disturbing phenomenon was an intense emotional flashback. So, what he was feeling was an intense flashback. That's why he was unable to respond, besides to flight, to flee. Okay, moving on. Some years later, I came to understand the nature of this type of regression. I realized it was a flashback to the hundreds of times my mother, in full homicidal visage, blasted me with her rage into terror, shame, dissociation, and helplessness. This is how his mother reprimanded him or corrected him, was yelling and screaming at him, right? Emotional flashbacks are also accompanied by intense arousals of fight, flight, instinct, along with hyper arousal of the sympathetic nervous system, sorry, the half of the nervous system that controls arousal and activation. Mm. When fear is the dominant emotion in a flashback, the person feels extremely anxious, panicky, or even suicidal. When despair predominates, a sense of profound numbness, Paralysis and desperation to hide may occur. A sense of feeling small, young, fragile, powerless, and helpless is also commonly experienced in an emotional flashback, and all symptoms are typically overlaid with humiliating and crushing toxic shame. So there was a lot that he said there, right? Okay. Because he's not talking about obviously the first foundation of manifesting this character right back into his relationships again, right? Manifesting his mother into this relationship. Okay. Ain't that crazy? So he coded his mother from emotional abuse, right? Toxic shame into a full blown relationship with a woman who has the same, I won't say issues, but the same way of how to communicate, which is yelling, which is ridicule, which is putting a person down, right? He naturally went back into how he responded to that toxic shame and he fled. So the currency continues of the cycle of the trauma of the flight. There are his is flight. So now he's going to talk a little bit about the toxic shame because that goes hand in hand. That's toxic shame. Remember, I was just talking about how my grandfather would ridicule his whole family, all y'all black tar babies or something like that out in front of all of their friends, ridicule them out in public, put them down in front of public to make himself look better, basically, is what I'm thinking. So that's the form of toxic shame. So let's get into it. Toxic shame, the veneer of an emotional flashback. I hope you guys are all with me. Don't forget to like and subscribe because we're going to get into this. We're not only going to talk about and inscribe words of power, but we are aware of our huge brain systematic computer. All right. We're not in battle of it. We're aware of it. So we know why we make the choices that we make every day. Okay. Based on these effects. Toxic shame, the veneer of an emotional flashback. Toxic shame, explored enlightenedly by John Bradshaw in Healing the Shame That Binds, obliterates a CPTSD survivor's self esteem with an overwhelming sense that he is loathsome, ugly, stupid, or fatally flawed. One more time. Toxic Shame Explored Enlightenedly by John Bradshaw in Healing the Shame That Binds, obliterates a CPTSD survivor's self esteem with an overwhelming sense that he is loathsome, ugly, stupid, or fatally flawed. Overwhelming self disdain is typically a flashback to the way he felt when suffering the contempt and visual screwing of his traumatizing parent. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense to y'all because that makes so much sense. The toxic shame is basically belittling. So they're giving you actual concepts. All right. But they're saying one to make feel ugly, one who is made to feel stupid, who is fatally flawed, who will forever be flawed. An example of this is, a lot of people who are raised with their one parent or their guardian, and, the child are reflections of the opposite guardian that is not there. So the parent taking care of the child um, will let the child know that they are fatally flawed because they are a part of the other parent that is not there. The the parent that's like, you ain't shit, you ain't gonna never be shit, you're just like that, your father, or you're just like your mother, you ain't shit, you ain't gonna never be shit, you're just like them. Okay? That is what he's referring to as being fatally flawed. Or if you had, a guardian or a parent who never gave you appraisal for your looks or anything, which is the opposite of that, of the child thinking that they're ugly because, at home, their foundation, their guardian aren't giving them any kind of appraisals of their physical looks, right? Or they're not giving any appraisals for the good deeds that they have in their life, the good deeds that they are doing, but yet they will reprimand them for the not so good deeds, if that makes sense, right? If you're not praising your children, the opposite of that is them feeling stupid, okay, and fatally flawed. Overwhelming self disdain is typically a flashback to the way he felt when suffering the contempt and visual screwing of his traumatizing parent. Toxic shame can also be created by constant parental neglect and rejection. Hey, how you doing? This is important though because when like 10, 15 years ago when people were talking about toxic parents on live and how they got rid of their toxic parents. This is why, because of the toxic shame, okay, that can be created by constant parental neglect and rejection. So they neglect to realize that they have the star being the child here. Okay, they neglect. That is a good thing that they have a child, a star being a part of two, now three, which is the manifestation of creativity of love from two, right? Often parents forget that children are blessings, period, and they reject them. And children pick up on this right away. They even said, you know, even in their newborn stages, and I read books like this before, even in the newborn stages, infants can pick up the emotional imbalance of their guardian. Ashe gratitude, Amen Ra. How you doing, lovely Grace? Toxic shame. See, that is definitely passed down because a lot of parents aren't aware of the ridicule, the belittling that they do to their children. And then their children does the same thing to their children. The belittling, the put down, the rejection. Okay. So this is why this is important to be aware of these terms and concepts. Okay. So he's going to talk a little bit more about this toxic shame. Hey. Early in my career, I worked with David, a handsome, intelligent man who was a professional actor. One day, David came to see me after an unsuccessful audition. Besides himself, he burst out. I never let on to anyone, but I know that I'm really very ugly. It is so stupid that I'm trying to be an actor when I'm so painful to look at. Mm, mm, mm. I will never forget how shocked and disbelieving I felt at first that such a handsome person could feel ugly, but further exploration brought me understanding. This is key. This is key. David's childhood was characterized by broad spectrum abuse and neglect. He was the last and unwanted child of a family, of a large family. And his alcoholic father repeatedly attacked and looked at him with disgust. To make matters worse, his family imitated his father and frequently humiliated him with heavy doses of contempt. His older brother's favorite gibe, accompanied by nauseated grimace, was, "I can't stand the sight of you. You make me want to vomit." You see how toxic shame trickles down? And this is exactly why this character, David, was like, although he was handsome, this is why so many people who are beautiful, like on the outside, are like unaware of it, is because of the toxic shame from their parents. And their parents are unaware of it because their parents did it to them as well. It's a cycle. Ashe, ashe, ashe. Moving on, it says that toxic shame can obliterate your self-esteem in the blink of an eye, especially in your early, I'm adding this last piece in here, especially in your early childhood development. Okay? He didn't put that in there, but I did. He just says toxic shame can obliterate your self-esteem in the blink of an eye. This is why still to this day that my mother hates mirrors. She doesn't like to take pictures. She hates mirrors. She has one mirror. She will never take a picture. I'm opposite, obviously. Toxic shame can obliterate your self esteem in a blink of an eye. In an emotional flashback, you can regress instantly into feeling and thinking that you are worthless and contemptible as your family perceived you. So, as my mother was being ridiculed with all her siblings out in the open, that you black tar babies, although my grandfather is black as tar as night too, but you black bitch, you black that. When you are stranded in a flashback, toxic shame devolves into the intensely painful alienation of the abandonment melange. Why do you? A rolling morass of shame, fear, and depression. He says the abandonment melange is the fear and toxic shame that surrounds and interacts with the abandonment depression. The abandonment depression itself is the dead end feeling of helplessness and hopelessness that afflicts traumatized children. So he's saying the abandonment melange is the fear and toxic shame that surrounds and interacts with the abandonment depression. Yikes. The fear of lack of performance, the fear of being judged, right? The abandonment depression itself is the deadened feeling of helplessness where you don't feel like you're good enough, right? And this is why they're talking about that actor. He didn't feel like he was good enough. Toxic shame, and a little bit, my nieces are going to be coming in here probably screaming. So just give them a couple seconds and you'll hear them screaming. Toxic shame also inhibits us from seeking comfort and support. In a reenactment of a childhood abandonment, we are flashing back to we often isolate ourselves and helplessly surrender to an overwhelming feeling of humiliation. I know that's a lot of words, right? It's a lot of words, concepts. Like he's trying to keep it as simple as basic as possible, right? Toxic shame also inhibits us from seeking comfort and support. So when you're ridiculed out in open, out in public, when you're just ridiculed solo with one person, right? It's very difficult to seek support and comfort from someone when the one who was your guardian, the one who gave you parental advice, stressed you out the most, right? So why would someone go seek support and comfort, right? out of being shamed from their parent or the guardian. Like, why would they go and seek help when their very parent or guardian are the one who displaced their emotions? So why would someone want to go and seek help after that? That's what he's talking about, right? Toxic shame also inhibited us from seeking comfort and support. Okay. And I think, like a lot of older generations, this is why they refuse to seek support as well. In a reenactment of the childhood abandonment, we are flashing back to we often isolate ourselves and helplessly surrender to an overwhelming feeling of humiliation. If you are stuck viewing yourself as worthless, defective, or despicable, you are probably in an emotional flashback. And I want you to highlight that. Okay, this is daily, even when you wake up. Okay. If you are, if your brain computer, pay attention to what thoughts are coming through when you get out of bed, when you roll off the concrete, whatever, when you get out of bed, when you roll out of your car, okay? Whatever, wherever you are, pay attention to your thoughts because it doesn't matter where you are. It's about your mind, your mental state. What are the first cues or what are the first thoughts? What are the first emotions that are vibrating with you, right? Because he's saying, like, if you are stuck viewing yourself as worthless, defective, or despicable, you are probably in an emotional flashback. This is typically also true when you are lost in self hate and virulent self criticism. I could like criticism, I could never say that word. Self criticism. So self hate, putting down yourself, right? Not liking myself. Oh, I hate my face. Oh, I hate this about me, or I hate this about me. Like general and self hate. This is typically also true when you are lost in self hate and when you are critical, right, of yourself. This comes from toxic shame. When you are lost in self hate, when you hate yourself, you don't feel like you're good enough, and when you are critically talking about yourself, this is all forms of toxic shame. All right. Immediate help for managing emotional flashbacks can be found at the beginning of chapter 8, which lists 13 practical steps for resolving flashbacks. Okay. So he had already came up with 13 practical steps for resolving these flashbacks that bring forth toxic shame. Pay attention to the first step is being aware of your brain computer, being aware of how you talk to yourself and how you talk to other people, being aware of that. So he goes on to talk about a little how numerous clients and respondents to my website tell me that the concept of emotional flashbacks brings them a great sense of relief. They report that for the first time, they are able to make some sense of their troubled lives. A common comment has been, now I understand why all the psychological and spiritual approaches I have pursued had had so few answers for me. Listen to that. A common comment has been, now I understand why all the psychological and spiritual approaches I have pursued had so few answers for me. Many also note feeling freed from a shaming list of misdiagnoses that have been given to them by themselves or others. This, in turn, has aided them in ridding themselves of the self destructive habit of amassing evidence of their own defectiveness or craziness. Many also report a quantum leap in their motivation to challenge the learned habits of self hate and self disgust. And that's what we're on. Quantum leaps, okay, in their motivation to challenge the learned habits of self hate and self disgust. Let's see how many more pages we got here, y'all. Just a couple more. So we're going to get into the list of common CPTSD symptoms. Okay. And this is all just to be self-aware. Maybe you are, you understand these points, reflections that are going in and outside of you. But he's going to list the most common forms of CPTSD symptoms. Survivors may not experience all of these. Varying combinations are common. Factors affecting this are your 4F type and your childhood abuse neglect pattern. So remember earlier in the video, we talked about 4 points to look for in this chapter. The third point was the 4F responses. How fight, flight, freeze, and fawn manifest in survivors. Fight, flight, freeze, and fawn are the 4F responses of childhood abuse neglect patterns. Okay, we gonna get through this, y'all. We gonna get through it. Yes. 1, emotional flashbacks. We talked about that, which are identifying those sudden, often non-visual regressions to the overwhelming feeling states of childhood. Okay. Second, tyrannical inner and outer critic. Okay, tyrannical. And I like that he used the word tyrannical because I referred to that as my dad. His inner critic is very defining, very defining. He's very critical internally, right? And when he speaks out loud, he speaks from this tyrannical type of concept, and it's interesting because I know how and where and why it falls in that place. But is he aware of that? No. Because once we are aware of things, we change. Once we know better, we do better. Third, toxic shame, like I was talking about, how our grandfather would ridicule all his kids. He has 7 of them. Self-abandonment, which is self-isolation, where we don't seek comfort for other people or from other things or from an animal, like going to the petting zoo, or just going to, go pet a cat somewhere, go to a cat cafe, or go visit some cats somewhere, So that's a part of self-abandonment, by not seeking comfort. Okay, a balanced comfort. Social anxiety, the inability to go into public spaces. Abject feelings of loneliness and abandonment, all right, which is tied into social anxiety and self abandonment. Next, fragile self esteem, looking for external validation is fragile self esteem. Next, attachment disorder. Child, do we really need to go there? Attachment disorder. I know I had this a lot, especially when I moved out when I was like 17. I always felt like I needed to be around people. People needed to be around me. I always felt like I had to be around people all the time. I had to be attached to something. And the attachment was nothing but drugs and alcohol. That's why I wanted to be around people. It was to affiliate that. Developmental arrest. Big, 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 big. Developmental arrest. Now, there are some key points, okay, in our life, in stages in our life, where our brains are fully developed, right? But when those who suffer from childhood abuse, trauma, there are going to be some developmental arrest in our life streams where we don't have the ability to develop in certain areas because of the stagnation. Next, relationship difficulties. The inability to have to come to an agreement in relationships, because we all know in relationships it takes it's a process. There's not one perfect relationship. And I'm talking about in all relationships, with your cats, with your dogs, with your children, with your mom and your dad. It's a working process, right? So the inability to find that middle ground in these relationship processes, right? So that's where the relationship difficulties come in, the inability to find grounding in relationships. Next, radical mood vacillations. That is interesting. This is the first time I heard about this. Radical mood vacillations, pseudo psychomania. Okay, that's in chapter 12. When he says mood, I'm just saying, referring to the highs and the lows that comes with mood. Disassociation via distracting activities or mental processes. Disassociation via distracting activities or mental processes. Distracting activities. I know I've done that many times, okay? Instead of getting to the point of the cause of the childhood development, let's go take another course. Let's go get another degree. You know, let's go earn another certificate. Let's not go and visit home for 20 years. Hair triggered flight or fight response, oversensitivity to stressful situations, and suicidal ideation. So this may be a little bit heavy, this next part where we're going to refer to suicidal ideation, but this is really a part of the CPTSD syndrome. So why be afraid to talk about it, to reflect it, and to be aware of it? All right. This is part of the survival to thriving, these emotional flashbacks, right? These symptoms will form for some, not all, of suicide ideation. So let's see what Mr. Pete Walker is going to refer to here. Suicidal ideation is a common phenomenon in CPTSD, particularly during intense or prolonged flashbacks. Suicidal ideation is depressed thinking or fantasizing about wanting to die. Some things you can't really say on here, but we're still not going to stop because the message is still going to be there. There is so much infliction. When I read stats that 1 in 3 women and then 1 in 5 boys, there is a general need here, right? There's a general awareness that needs to be accepted. We don't care about the keywords and the keyframes that YouTube and TikTok and Twitter and Facebook and Instagram don't like to use. Okay. They only want psychologists, psychiatrists to use these forms of words. This is why I'm referring to Pete Walker's book, right? So, suicide ideation is depressed thinking or fantasizing. Even depressed thinking is a form of suicide ideation, okay? Or fantasizing about wanting to not be here anymore. It can range from active suicidality to passive. Passive is far more common with CPTSD survivors who I have known, and it is ranges from wishing they were dead to fantasizing about ways to do it. When lost in these frames of ideation, the survivor may even pray to be delivered from this life or fantasize about being taken by some act of fate. Mm, mm, mm. I see that a lot. Just people word it differently. Some you might hear will say, "Oh, this world is crazy. Oh, this world is going to hell and it's not going to get any better," or stuff like that, referring to themselves as a place in the world. How it's getting worse, how it's getting worse, how it's not going to get better. Or even with some instances, you will hear that people will say, "Oh, how the world is evil," right? Or how everybody is evil. I believe these are all forms of ideation of not being here either. They're just using the language in a different way. Okay. Because they're formalizing their experiences, who they are in this life, in a negative form. So pay attention to how people talk about the world and their place within the world, especially yourself, you in the world and your place within the world. Do you see it as a life forming change where you bring the change, or do you see it as evil and negative and how the world is getting worse and all of that? Okay. He goes on to say, when lost in these forms of ideation, the survivor may even pray to be delivered from this life or fantasize about being taken by some act of fate. He may even think or obsess without being serious, stepping out in front of something or jumping off of something. Fantasy typically ends, however, without a serious intent to remove yourself. This is as opposed to active, obviously, where the person is actively proceeding in the direction of not being here anymore. I am discussing passive not being here anymore because it does not merit the same kind of alarm in active not being here anymore. Passive not being here anymore is typically a flashback to early childhood when our abandonment was so profound that it was natural for us to wish that God or somebody or something would just put an end to it all. Let's put a pen into that because I just see this stretching a little bit more in forms of religion. I'm sorry, but not sorry. Okay. They don't give you the optimism about being here right now, having heaven on earth today, right now. Okay. They're talking about how the world is negative, how the world is evil, but yet they are the form of motivation and inspiration. And they're telling you that you get to have your heaven after you die. Ain't that something? So you come here to suffer? I think not. I think not. This is why I pay attention to those who are talking about themselves within their life and how they're taking part of this world. Is it a negative form or is it a positive form of how they see themselves in this world? All right, so we're gonna do a couple more minutes, you guys. Thanks for hanging out. We're actually on only on page 8. And in this chapter, we probably got like 4 or 5 pages left, but we'll do part 2 next Sunday. But we're gonna continue here and then the next couple pages here. So when the survivor catches himself in that instance where he doesn't want to be here, he will benefit from seeing it both in an emblem of how much pain he is in and as a sign of particularly intense flashback. So when I'm referring to my parents, especially my one parent who refuses to look in mirrors, who refuses to take picture because of the toxic shame of my grandfather saying that they're black as night, they're black as tar, they're black, they ain't shit, right? And then how still today, how they're referring to the world and themselves in a negative frame through religion. But yet there's no awareness of why, right? It's just stand put that the world is negative and that the world is coming to an end and that the world is just getting worse and worse and worse. Anyway, y'all, I'm sorry I'm laughing because that is like, whoo, child. When the survivor catches himself in this form, he will benefit from seeing it both as an emblem of how much pain he or she is in, as a sign of a particularly intense flashback. Then, this then can direct him to use the flashback management steps. If, however, flashback management does not help, and you not wanting to be here becomes increasingly active, they're giving you a number to the National Not Wanting to Be Here hotline, 1 800 273 8255. So if you have issues with managing your flashbacks and you really don't want to be here at this point in time, they are advised right now to call the National Not Wanting to Be Here hotline, 1 800 273 8255, or visit the website, which is www.suicidepreventionlifeline.org, because this is a flashback that you may need help managing and you will get good help there. Skilled therapists and caregivers learn to discriminate between active and passive not wanting to be here, and do not panic and categorize when encountering the later. Instead, the counselor invites the survivor to explore his not wanting to be here and the feelings, knowing that in most cases, verbal ventilation of the flashback pain underneath it will deconstruct the not wanting to be here sense. So the verbal initiation of the flashback will destruct the frame of the feeling of emotions of not wanting to be here. So saying it out loud how you feel in the flashback that you are experiencing right now, right? Talking to someone about that. Okay, so if you can't get past the flashback where it's taking you where you don't want to be here, they want you to call these numbers. They want you to reach out for help because they want you to talk it out, because it is written, it has been studied that verbal ventilation will help that process. Okay, you guys, so we're going to do this loss. We're going to do a couple more pages here. We're going to do what you may have been misdiagnosed with and origins of CPTSD, and then I'll let you guys go. And we'll do part 2 next Sunday. So let's get into it. So far, we covered the definition of what CPTSD is. We talked about the emotional flashbacks. We talked about the 4 F responses. Briefly. So now Mr. Pete Walker, is going to give us some insight on to what you may have been misdiagnosed with. He said, may have been misdiagnosed with. Okay. I once heard renowned traumatologists. I didn't even know that even existed, baby. If I'm sorry, let's put a pin here. And I don't even know, because this is obviously my lane. My study is trauma, right? Originated, it was my lane in my study. But baby, in order to get this level as being a traumatologist and a psychologist, which is where I am like conceptually, is resources. So if anybody wants me to go back for my master's, finish my master's, then let me know. I once heard renowned traumatologist John Berry quip that if CPTSD were ever given its due, the DSM used by all mental health professionals would shrink from its dictionary like to the size of a thin pamphlet. Ah, shay. And this is why I didn't want to go through the course of study of being a psychologist, because of all of the confusion of this diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders. Okay, let's do this again. I once heard renowned traumatologist John Bree quip that if CPTSD were ever giving its due, the DSM, which is the Diagnostic of Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder, used by all mental health professionals, would shrink from its dictionary like size to the size of a thin pamphlet. In other words, the role of traumatized childhoods in most adult psychological disorders is enormous. In other words, the role of traumatized childhoods in most adult psychological disorders is enormous. I have witnessed many clients with CPTSD misdiagnosed with various anxiety and depressive disorders. Let's read that again. I have witnessed many clients with CPTSD misdiagnosed with various anxiety and depressive disorders. Moreover, many are also unfairly and inaccurately labeled with bipolar, narcissistic, codependent, autistic spectrum, and borderline disorders. This is not to say that CPTSD does not sometimes co occur with these disorders. That is key. That is so, I knew this so long ago when I was in pharmacology. Like, what is the underlying issue, causes, okay, of the bipolar, of the codependency? Now, I didn't tap into the autistic spectrum. That's something else. That's something completely different. Okay. Moving on, he says further confusion also arises in the case of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. Put a pin in there too. Put a pin in there too. Because my oldest brother, who is just turned 54, who's in the Philippines now, celebrating his birthday, right? But when he was in elementary school, this is for my mom because, of course, I wasn't alive. He was in elementary school. They put him on Ritalin. Okay, he was on Ritalin for so-called ADHD. But you know what? He was only on there for a week because it made his symptoms worse. He had to be removed and taken off of it. So when my mother was telling me this years later, I'm thinking like, what were the underlying issue? Because here is a kid, a child, who is associating himself with his environment. How his behavior is at school is because of his environment at home. So let's start there, but that's too much work. Let's just put them on Ritalin. Okay. So he's like, this is also true for attention deficit disorder and some depressive and dissociative disorders, which similarly can more accurately be described as fixated freeze response to trauma. A fixated freeze response to trauma. A fixated freeze response to trauma. Because we have to remember, these are little kids, right? How can you be born with ADHD? That's crazy. It's something that's stemming from the environment. Moving on. Furthermore, this is not to say that those misdiagnosed do not have issues that are similar to correlative with the disorders above. The key point is that these labels are incomplete and unnecessarily shaming descriptions of what the survivor is actually afflicted with. Reducing CPTSD to panic disorder is like calling food allergies chronically itchy eyes. What? What? Reducing CPTSD to, got it. Panic disorder is like calling food allergies chronically itchy eyes. Over focusing treatment on the symptoms of panic in the former case and eye health in the later does little to get at root causes. I should highlight that. It does little, as a matter of fact, it does nothing for the root cause. This is why I got this book, because this guy is in true alignment to my thoughts and in true alignment why the work still goes on. Feelings of panic or itchiness in the eyes can be masked with medication, but all of the associated problems that cause these symptoms will be untreated. Moreover, most of the diagnoses mentioned above are typically treated as innate categorological defects rather than as learned maladaptations to stress. Adaptations that survivors were forced to learn as traumatized children. And most importantly, because these adaptations were learned, they can often be extinguished or significantly diminished and replaced with more functional adaptations to stress. Ashe. These are adaptations bridged on, I mean, we can't really see it, but we can feel it and we can study it by behavior, right? In this vein, I believe that many substances and process addictions also begin as misguided maladaptations to parental abuse and abandonment. Ashe. Okay, this is really prevalent and very important to understand in this vein, that he does believe that many substances and process addictions also began as misguided maladaptation and abandonment. Okay, so when I went back to live with my father, my, now I understand why I really wasn't raised with him. Okay, sun up, sundown. That's all he did was abuse drugs. Sun up to sundown. I had to get out of there. I saw, heard, understood the assignment of why I wasn't raised in that environment. Okay. And then I had to look at myself in the mirror. It's like, at this age, do you want to be doing the same way? The same thing? No. No. But I already made a promise to myself years ago that I was not going to transform out of this body with toxic behaviors and toxic issues and bullshit from this life. We relinquish it now, today, in bliss and beauty. Today. Not when you get 40, 50, 60, 70, and 80 years old. Today. Because people are watching you. Your children are watching you. So I had to do a real clear review. Like, girl, you really want to have a pipe in your hand 24/7 in your 50s, 60s, 70s? Fuck no. Excuse my language, but that's just how my spirit was like, girl, fuck no. No, ma'am. Because I know my father is definitely forms of abandon and abuse from his early hot childhood development and tra la 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 la, where his sisters were raped by their stepdad, and he probably was too. But me and my brothers, we never knew that. Why do we have to wait until we're adults to know that? Child. So I had to. My brother removed himself off the scene. Me, I'm just like, I'm, I'm sorry right now. No attachments to any forms of addiction. None. They are early. These addictions, you guys, are early maladaptations to parental abuse and abandonment. They are early adaptations that are attempts to soothe and distract. To soothe and distract from mental, emotional, and physical pain of chronic post traumatic stress. Now, not only soothe, but to distract. We're almost done, y'all. Thanks for hanging out. This is the last two paragraphs, okay? Thank y'all for being here. I really, really appreciate you guys. Thank you. Thank y'all for being here and hanging out, listening and engaging in this critical read. But it's all in the form of awareness because we are breaking cycles. We've already broken cycles, okay? Let's continue. Let's continue to break cycles. So our final piece here I'm going to leave you guys with is the origins of CPTSD. What are the origins of CPTSD? What are the origins, y'all? Because we hear about PTSD, right? From those who suffer from trauma. But CPTSD is chronic for a reason. So what are the origins of CPTSD? So he asked us that how do traumatically abused and or abandoned children develop CPTSD? How, Craig? How, Craig? Where they do that at, Craig? How children develop this, Craig? He says, while the origins of CPTSD is most often associated with extended periods of physical and or sexual abuse in childhood, by observations convince me that my observations convince me that ongoing verbal and emotional abuse also causes it. Because like I said, I was giving an example of my grandfather and how he ridiculed all his 7 children. Let's read that again. While the origin of CPTSD is most often associated with extended periods of physical and or sexual abuse in childhood, my observations convince me that ongoing verbal and emotional abuse also causes it. My part of me want to be like, duh. Duh. You got to make light out of all of this, right? Because the sun is shining today. Many dysfunctional parents react contemptuously to a baby or toddler's plaintive call for connection and attachment. Child, we were talking about this earlier. Contempt is extremely traumatizing to a child and at best extremely noxious to an adult. Let's read that again. Many dysfunctional parents react contemptuously to a baby or toddler's plaintive call for connection and attachment. And when they're referring to contemptuously, it's like, Oh, I got to do this again. Oh, they're crying again. Oh, I have to go get them again. Oh, I have to go feed them again. And the child and the baby is picking up on these signals. Okay. So he says, my observations convince me that ongoing verbal and emotional abuse also, oh, my bad. Wrong sentence. Contempt is extremely traumatizing to a child and at best extremely nauseous to an adult. So when, your kid has practice or when your kid's crying or when they're hungry and you're all like, that's what he's referring to. Contempt is a toxic cocktail of verbal and emotional abuse, a deadly amalgam of denigration, rage, and disgust. Contempt is a toxic cocktail of verbal and emotional abuse, a deadly amalgam of, um, didn't I just say this word? Denigration, rage, and disgust. Rage creates fear, and disgust creates shame in the child in a way that soon teaches her or him to refrain from crying out or from even asking for attention. We read this in one of my books, like last year on one of this channel, when we were talking about when children cry out and seek for help and the parents' response, even in the infancy stage, okay, contributes to the early childhood development. Your response to the direction of the child who is seeking love, who is seeking attention, your response, due diligent to the child, right, affects the child early. Now, of course, when you got a newborn, nobody's going to be jumping up for joy and happy jumping and skipping, right? When you're tired, but it's about your approach to it, your mental state, your emotional state approach to helping your child who's crying. Before long, the child gives up on seeking any kind of help or connection at all. The child bids for bonding and acceptance is thwarted, and he or she is left to suffer in the frightened despair of abandonment. Particularly abusive parents deepen the abandonment trauma by linking corporal punishment with contempt. Now we're talking about this corporal punishment. This keeps coming up again. I read it in my last book. I'm gonna have to break it out of my storage and get it back out again, right? Referring to corporal punishment and how it afflicts children, not help and situate the children, but afflicts children. Corporal punishment with contempt. Mm, 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 mm. Ooh, child, listen to what he about to say next. Slaveholders typically use contempt and scorn to destroy their victims' self-esteem. Slaves and children who are made to feel worthless and powerless devolve into learned helplessness and can be controlled with far less energy and attention. Cult leaders also use contempt to shrink their followers into absolute submission after luring them in with brief phrases of fake, unconditional love. Come as you are to my church, but don't date men or women. Don't come as you are, but don't do this. All right. Last couple sentences here. Furthermore, CPTSD can also be caused by emotional neglect alone. This key theme is explored at lengths in Chapter 5. If you notice that you are berating yourself because your trauma seems insignificant compared to others, please skip ahead to this chapter and resume reading here upon completion. Emotional neglect also typically underlines most traumatizations. Emotional neglect also typically underlie most traumatizations that are more glaringly evident. Parents who routinely ignore or turn their back on their child's calls for attention, connection, or help abandon their child to unmanageable amounts of fear, and the child eventually gives up and succumbs to depressed, death like feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. These types of rejections simultaneously magnify the child's fear and eventually add a coating of shame to it. Over time, this fear and shame begets a toxic inner critic that holds the child and later the adult totally responsible for his parents' abandonment until he becomes his own worst enemy and descends into the bowels of CPTSD. Okay. So we covered a lot, right? We covered a lot. I think the most what I want you guys to take with you are these forms of what the definition are and these features of CPTSD, right? The forms, right? And the features of CPTSD. The definition, the forms, and the features of PTSD. CPTSD. The most key part are, which afflict a lot of people who aren't actually aware of the negative self critical talk, are the emotional flashbacks. Okay, so let's go over the 4 key points. From surviving to thriving, right? From surviving to thriving by Pete Walker. Here are the, we really didn't talk about the goal of recovery. We'll get to that next week. We stopped on page 11, where next time we pick back up, we're going to talk more about trauma. We're going to talk more about it, baby. We're going to talk about it, people. We're going to talk about it, guys. But the 4 points that we had here are the definition of CPTSD, which is moving beyond standard PTSD to include the effects of prolonged childhood abandonment or neglect. The second key point was the emotional flashbacks, which are identifying those sudden, often non visual regressions to the overwhelming feeling states of childhood, right? Those emotional flashbacks, right? They make you feel so insignificant. All right. And the next 2 points we'll talk more about are the 4 F responses: the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And then the 4 point is the goal of recovery. The goal of recovery. That healing is a gradual process of moving from a state of constant survival into one where you can truly thrive. And we know that we can truly thrive through quantum leaping. One way of quantum leap is being aware. The second way, words of power. Get to it, baby. Nothing to it but to do it, right? So if I can break generational curses on many levels, you will too. I appreciate each and every one of you. Take care of yourself.